You can go ahead and turn in your Bibles to Ecclesiastes. Reminder, we will not meet next week. We will not meet next week. And because of the heroic efforts by the Tuesday group, sadly, they were the guinea pigs, and we discovered we cannot do what my plan was, which was to attack the book of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon all at once in a round 20-chapter. Yeah, no. So that plan didn't work. So, because we pushed so hard yesterday, or with the Tuesday group, it let us kind of honestly see what our upper limits are and for our cruising speed as we go through the rest of the Old Testament. We are leaving our verse-by-verse study that we really slowed down for Proverbs. It was very strong, but 10 weeks through the Proverbs is a lot. A lot of principles that we studied during that time. So now that we're back in our normal flow of AC3, we are going back to that chapter-by-chapter synopsis as we look through what it is that Solomon, still the author of these next two books, Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, what he has for us. Song of Solomon is unique, but that kind of goes without saying. Everything in the Bible is brilliant. Even the layout of the Bible in the canon as it's presented to us in our current day, even that is instructive. As we flow from the book of Proverbs, a book in it where everything is good. Like, you don't have to worry about testing. You test all things, of course, but you don't have to worry about testing anything in the book of Proverbs. He does all of his homework in the beginning. He shows all the reasons why you can trust everything in that book in the first 8 chapters. He explains, when I say it, you can take it to the bank, and here's why. Showed all his work then, and then he proceeds to show us the conclusions throughout the rest of the book. And it's fantastic. You can take any verse out of Proverbs, hide it in your heart without any worry or concern at all, and none of that is accurate for the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes is a book where every single thing you read must be tested against the Word of God to see if it is true. Books like this is why we say everything in the Bible is accurate, but not everything in the Bible is true. Because there's going to be things that Solomon says, we're going to look at it and go, there's no way this can be correct. And you're right, it's not. Because Solomon is working through something. And as we begin to study this book, we need to begin by looking at the end. So please turn over to chapter 12. And I'm going to read a couple of verses here so we can see the conclusion of the book from the beginning. It's the only way to not get lost as we go through it. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, if you would look down at verse 9, we're going to go to the end of the book. We're going to see what the final conclusion is at the beginning. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Starting in verse 9, Solomon calls himself the preacher here. So in addition to being a wise man, the preacher, that's Solomon referring to himself, also taught the people knowledge. And he pondered, searched out, and arranged many proverbs. The preacher sought to find delightful words and to write words of truth correctly. The words of wise men are like goads, or like sharp sticks that get you moving. And masters of these collections of proverbs are like well-driven nails. They hold everything together. They're not easy to pop back out. They are given by one shepherd. But beyond this, my son, be warned. Now, it's no accident that the book of Ecclesiastes is, we see at the end, it's addressed to a son. What was the book of Proverbs addressed to? It was addressed to Solomon's son. My child, over and over again. He is talking to the next king, preparing the next king of Israel. Here he says the same thing, my son, be warned, verse 12. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. So learning for learning's sake. Verse 13, the conclusion when it has all been heard. So I'm going to distill all information and all wisdom to you in one single statement is this: fear God and keep his commandments. Because this applies to every person, and here's the hidden part that he doesn't say out loud, even the king. Even you, my child, who will be the next king of Israel. Even you have to understand this. Because verse 14, for God will bring every act to judgment. Everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. Fear God, obey his commandments, because one day the King of Kings is going to judge you. That's the conclusion of the book. By reading and understanding the conclusion of Ecclesiastes, it becomes easier to navigate the entire book. Even so, we need to understand 2 concepts that Solomon is going to repeat over and over and over again. so that we will not be overwhelmed by the book, because there's going to be parts of this book that get very, very dark. One of those repeated items is this: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now, the word vanity will be repeated about 19 times in this book. Vanity of vanities appears twice, one in the beginning, one at the end, right before the conclusion that we just read. Those two vanities of vanities, or vanity of vanities, act as the cornerstone where this entire journey is built on, and then the capstone as he concludes his entire journey. And these will be the beginning and end of Solomon's struggle. And that is what the book of Ecclesiastes is it is the record of the journey of Solomon as he sought to answer this one important question that we all ask at some point: what is the meaning of life? This is the journey. This is the smartest man who ever lived, the wisest man who ever lived. And he explores every road, and he goes down and learns every conclusion until he reaches the final conclusion that we just read in Ecclesiastes 12:13. But before he gets to that final conclusion, and he stays there, he goes down road after road after road, and every single road leads to a dead end, and the sign at the end of all of those dead ends is this: a sign with a single word that says vanity. Everything is vanity. Everything is like striving, trying to catch the wind in your hands. And that's depressing. But we only get that full meaning when we combine it with the other repeated saying throughout this book: under the sun. Under the sun. It is so important for us to understand that every time Solomon looks at one of these dead-end roads, it's because it's under the sun. The term under the sun appears something like 30 times in the book. Vanity, 19 times. Under the sun, 30. Because everything that he runs into that it turns out to be vanity is under this giant umbrella of under the sun. And as long as you remain under the sun, then everything is vanity. That idea defines everything that Solomon will go through and consider. This book is a work that only someone like Solomon could ever have accomplished, because no one was as rich as Solomon and could indulge their every whim. No one was as wise as Solomon and could interpret what they were being exposed to. And nobody was positioned as king during a time of peace like Solomon, where he didn't have to worry about enemies. He didn't have to worry about wars. And whatever his heart desired, Solomon had the luxury to go and pursue. And what did Solomon learn with all of this? That under the sun, everything is vanity. The author of Ecclesiastes calls himself the preacher. We'll learn later on that this is Solomon, because he's the only one who will fit this description that we see in the book. But he calls himself the preacher, and that's how this book gets its name in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, this book is called Kohelet, which is the Hebrew word that is translated as preacher, as one who speaks forth to a crowd. That's what we see in verse 1, this idea of a person who speaks to a gathered assembly, speaking in front of a group. So a preacher or a teacher. We get the English title of Ecclesiastes from the Greek word that's used in the Septuagint. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Hebrew. And there, in that Greek collection, they called it ecclesia. It's the word that's translated as church in Matthew 16:18. So when you take both of those, you get the idea of what's going on. The idea is of a group all gathered together for a single purpose. And while that group is gathered together, the preacher comes forward, the teacher comes forward and goes, this is the meaning of life. And that's the point of the book. This image at the beginning of the book is of a gathered assembly. We are all here together to see what Solomon would say to us. And he begins to declare to us the meaning of life. Now, quick understanding of what's going on in our current day. In our current day, during the Feast of Tabernacles, which happens in the fall for the observant Jews, is that they will read this entire book. The Feast of Tabernacles is the celebration for the Jewish people that God was with us in the wilderness. When we lived in tabernacles and we were very vulnerable, God of gods was with us. For us, the Feast of Tabernacles reminds us that Jesus is Emmanuel. He is the God who is with us. For us, all of our hope is in him. For us, everything is not vanity because he gives everything meaning. But for the Jewish people who have rejected their Messiah, even now they look at this book and they go, everything under the sun is vanity. What hope is there for us? Wes, we look and see verse 3, Solomon begins the starting question, all right? So he introduces himself. Verse 3, he starts to go, okay, this is what we're going to look at today. And he starts it with this question: what is the point of the effort of man? Now, this is important, where he talks about what advantage does man have in all his work, or it may say something about a profit in his toil, depending on your translation. The idea is, what's the point of working so hard? Why do I put all of my life into the effort? And then he gives his clarifying statement: the effort that is under the sun. This is important, right? Solomon already knows the conclusion. This isn't an active diary where day by day he's working through it. He already knows where he's heading towards. So right here at the beginning, he goes, under the sun, what's the point of all our efforts? If all there is what we see, why work so hard? Verse 4 through 9 shows us why Solomon's even asking this question. Verse 4, people come and go, but the earth seems to last forever. Babies are born, old people pass away, but the earth keeps chugging along. But even the earth doesn't seem like it's ever satisfied. The sun goes up and goes down. Verse 5, the wind blows and the river runs to the sea. But here's the problem: the river never stops flowing. It's not like the sea is ever finally full, so even the river can't stop working. And he's looking around and go, what's the point? Nothing ever seems to get done. All these things keep going on and on without end, the endless toil of creation, and man can't even detect the half of what's going on. Verse 9, that which has been is that which will be. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, verse 9 is very important because it shows us the timelessness of this question, this concern, this observation. That whatever this generation thinks they're the first to discover, there's nothing new under the sun. I remember first understanding this concept being a little kid and first hearing the word cool. It's like, oh, this word, I go home and I tell my dad about this word cool that we've discovered our generation. He goes, oh, no, we used to say cool as well. And I'm like, no way, Dad, we are the first ones to come up with it. You guys weren't saying cool when you're out running around with the dinosaurs. Our generation was the one who came up with that. Every generation thinks they're the first. The first to see this, the first to deal with this or that. But as Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 10:13, there is absolutely nothing that you are going through, that you are encountering, any temptation you might experience that is unique just to you, but what is common to all people. It means you're not alone. That's wonderful. But it also means this: you're not the first one to deal with it. There is nothing new under the sun. Solomon confirms this in verse 10 through 11. He goes, can anybody really say, look, here's something new? Now, every generation might put their own spin on something. We'll do it in a different way, in a different package, but the heart and the principle is exactly the same. Nobody can go, this is something brand new. No one's ever been exposed to this kind of principle or idea or not. Verse 12 through 18, Solomon establishes what he plans on doing. Verse 12, he shows how he's chosen to identify himself. He goes, I, the preacher, have been king for a while under Jerusalem. So the idea being is, I'm not brand new to the game. I've been around for a while. I'm the king and I'm the son of a king. I have an idea of what this is all about. And during that time, I have seen a lot of things. Verse 14, he has been able to see all the works that have been done where? Under the sun. And he is qualified to consider all of this because of verse 16, there is no one who has increased in wisdom more than me. Therefore, verse 13 and 17, I set my mind to understand everything. Why? Because this is my gift. God gave me wisdom, the ability to understand. And the very first lesson I learned with all this wisdom that I have is simple: ignorance is bliss. Because the more you know, the more you understand, the more it hurts your heart. The more your heart hurts when you realize, verse 17, that you can't even learn it all. Even though you're the wisest person who ever lived outside of Jesus. To even try to learn everything is striving after the wind. The idea is of chasing the wind, hoping to catch it with your bare hand. What's the point? You'll never catch up to it. And even if you did, you couldn't hold it if you could. In chapter 2, in verse 1, we see that Solomon tries to find meaning and pleasure. Now, we're going to have a lot of this. He will go one direction and go, that's not it, and then he'll go to another direction. And he'll ping-pong back and forth in different areas as he's trying to figure out the meaning of life. So he goes, okay, Wisdom is not doing it. But I'm rich. So let me just try to find it in pleasure. Verse 2, he tried to find meaning in things that made him laugh, things that brought him joy. He goes, you know what? Endless laughter is just madness. Then in substances, verse 3, he said, I began to stimulate my body with wine. That's stand-in for anything that could begin to change your biology, change your body, the substances that you can bring in that would dull your senses and give you endless pleasure. But he found out that that is empty too. Why? Because life is short. Verse 4 through 6, then he says, you know what? Then I decided to build things because life is short. And if I just get drunk all day long, I'll waste my life, and life is too short. I need something that's going to outlast me. So I know what I'll do. I'll build lots of stuff. Big buildings that will outlast me, things that everyone will know how great I am. And every time I look at them, I'm like, I'm the one that built that building. It will give me pleasure. He said, I expanded my servants, my resources, gold and silver, verses 7 and 8. I surrounded myself with people whose sole job was to make me happy. Verse 9, all that I wanted I had. Verse 10, I denied myself nothing. And I did this until I was greater in pleasure than anyone else. And what's the conclusion of verse 11? Vanity. It's all vanity. It's like striving after the wind. None of it was profitable. Where? Under the sun, verse 11. Then he goes in the opposite direction, verse 12. He goes back to wisdom. He goes, okay, well, no, I need to get my thinking cap back on. I'm obviously missing something here. And he tells us that I have to be the one to do this because verse 12, no one coming after me will be able to do it as well as I can. That's what he means when he says, what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? All they can ever do is hope to walk in my footsteps. I'm the one that has to blaze the trail, so I'm going to put my mind to understanding this. And he found, verse 13, that, you know what, wisdom does have benefits. It's better than being a fool. But verse 14 and 15, what's the point? Because no matter how smart you are and how wise you are, the fate of the fool and the fate of the wise man are the same. They will both end up in the grave. Maybe a couple people might remember you for a little while, but before long, they'll have forgotten about you too. This is frustrating to Solomon. Verse 17, because all that learning is hard work. It takes work to learn. And the end of it was futile. It's like trying to catch the wind. So verse 18, he goes in a different direction again. He goes, you know what? I need to make sure that people remember me after I'm gone. I need a legacy. I need to make sure that when I'm gone, they remember that Solomon was here. But then he had a new struggle. If I go and I build up this entire empire, I have all these things that declare my goodness, I have to hand it over to something, and what if my kids are a bunch of fools? That becomes this new struggle now. That's verse 19. So if I work hard, Solomon realizes, and I give it to kids who don't value it, verse 21, they will squander it away. It'll be for nothing. Verse 24 through 26, we have a but. He stops here and goes, I'm not saying that hard work is pointless. Remember, he knows the conclusion already. In verses 24 through 26, Solomon goes back above the clouds. Everything so far has been what? Under the sun. And so he shoots through the clouds here and he goes up into the throne room of heaven, and he realizes that God gives us joy when we work hard, as long as we labor for God. And we do things as unto the Lord. For verse 25, how can we enjoy anything without God? So God is the one who gives things meaning. God is the one who gives us joy. But verse 26, the sinner doesn't realize this. For them, their effort is vanity. For them, all their work is like striving after the wind. Chapter 3 has one of the most famous passages of this book. You probably hear the song playing in your head as you look down these and you look at all these things that have a season. Solomon explains that there is an ordained time for everything under heaven. But the purpose of this is not to show us all these things that have a time. That's not the point. The point of these verses is to show us God is sovereign over human affairs. That he has appointed a season for all these different things that may happen in your life. That there are seasons where you may be occupied with this idea or having to put your effort towards that. There's a time when you have no kids and you can do what you want to do and you can sleep as late as you want, but then there's a season when you have kids and they get you up whether you want to be up or not. Then later on, you get up earlier than them. They don't want to get up, and that's a season too. And then one day they're gone, and then you look at that room and you go, oh, if only I could have it all back, but the season's gone. Because there was a time for that. There was a season for that. You don't have to like it, but you do need to know it, because it is only through this lens of God as sovereign that the course of a person's life makes sense. This is a fresh viewpoint. Solomon goes back now in verses 9 through 15. He goes, okay, let's look at the idea of hard work again from chapter 2. He asks, what's the point? What's the profit of the work of man? The profit comes when we realize that the work of our lives has to come from God, right? He's the one who makes the seasons of our lives. He's the one who determines the work that is at our hands. At the same time that he places this idea of work, he gives us the seasons of our lives. He goes, seasons end, eternity does not. And he places eternity inside of your heart because he needs you to always remember this, no matter how hard things are, how good a season is or how bad a season is, this will all end. I don't end. You were made for me. You were made for eternity. It keeps your eyes fixed above the clouds. You're not stuck under the sun. The sun rises and sets, but God never goes away. And this idea of his eternity, we don't live our lives thinking that all that we see is all there is. Verse 12 through 15, if we have this viewpoint, if we understand the eternity of God, his sovereignty over life, we learn life is a gift. It is to be enjoyed and celebrated as an act of worship to the Lord. Remember, we don't live for worship for pleasure's sake. It's not the point of life to make your life as comfortable as you can for you and get as much pleasure out of it as you can for you. Everything only has meaning when you look at it through the viewpoint of God. We don't view life with the mindset that life is here to bring pleasure to us, but we find its true meaning in verse 14. What God does lasts forever. Seasons come and seasons go, but the Lord is eternal. And a sovereign God has arranged the days of our life so that we will learn to fear, to revere, and to honor him. Verse 14. Verse 16, from this viewpoint of the sovereignty of God, Solomon considers that under the sun, there is injustice in this world. Now, here's the reality of going to that mountaintop experience and having the beauty of what it is that God has shown to Solomon. At some point, you got to go back in the valley. At some point, you have to go back under the clouds and understand that real life is here. And he looks at it and goes, you know what, okay, I know God is sovereign and he is on the throne, and that makes some really difficult questions I have to answer because there is injustice in this world. And because God is sovereign, that means that God has permitted it. Again, everything for a season. The wicked will not reign forever. We saw this in Psalms. We saw this in Proverbs. God permits it because of verse 17 and 18, because he is testing man to see what we truly are. And if you write in your Bibles right there next to verse 17 and 18, you may want to put Deuteronomy 13:3. Deuteronomy 13:3. Because in Deuteronomy 13:3, he answers a question that I have frequently had. Lord, why do you allow bad teachers, false teachers, to teach false things and lead so many astray? And he goes, I permit it to test your hearts to see whether you really love me. Will you follow what they tell you that sounds good to you? Will you take advantage of the vulnerable just because you can? Okay, but God is sovereign. He's testing. That sounds great, but in verse 19 through 22, we see that Solomon really struggles with the reality of evil, even as we do. We understand he is God. We know that one day he will make everything brand new. We know that one day it'll all turn to good. We know that one day he will wipe away every single tear, but it does not matter to our hearts in the middle when we see some of the things that happen on this earth. We struggle, Solomon struggles, until finally it overwhelms him in chapter 4. And in verse 1, we see him overwhelmed by the evil in the world. He said, I looked again at all the evil, and I saw the tears of the oppressed, and there was no one to wipe those tears away. It is such a soft moment. Such reality and honesty in Solomon's voice. Yes, Lord, one day you're going to wipe all these tears away, but it is most definitely not now. So many people are in pain. In verse 2 through 6, from this place of brokenness, he thinks to himself, you know what? It's better to be dead. Because at least then you can rest. You can escape all this evil, and you no longer have to run this endless rat race of life. It's what we saw in chapter 1. And then, to prove his point, verse 7 and 8, he gives us a case study in futility. He goes, consider a man who works hard all of his life and gathers all these things, but he doesn't even have the joy of being able to pass it off to someone that they love. A person in that kind of situation has to ask themselves at what point, what's the point of all my labor, of all the things that I have worked so hard to do? Verse 9 through 12, he goes, two people are better than one. If you can't have anything else, if you could just have one good companion, just one. Two are better than one, because if you get tired, they can pick you up. If they get tired, you can do the same for them. After all, Genesis 2:18, it is not good for man to be alone. If you could just have one good friend. But even better, from the garden, if you could have that third one that binds you together like a 3-strand cord. If that third companion is the Lord, then who can rip you apart then? In verse 13, Solomon reflects that someone who is poor but wise is better than a king who has stopped learning. For there's no end of people who would be happy to take the king's place. This doesn't come out of nowhere. He's thinking to himself. Think about Solomon towards the end of his life, where this book is probably being written, because he is talking about all the things, the entire journey. This is a man with, 700 wives and 300 concubines. He goes, but the days when I had just one person that I loved. It's what Song of Solomon is about. It's the reason why it follows this book. It's the reason why it follows the conclusion of this book. He goes, if only I had one. If I didn't become what I talk about here, the king who stopped learning. It was better to just be a poor kid who was wise and still learning. You know who was that poor kid who was wise and still learning? It was his dad, David. But when he became king, he stopped learning. Suddenly everything was good, and that's when he was in the greatest danger. And this is what Solomon is doing here. He's considering the testing of chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, that God tests our heart to see whether we would be righteous or wicked, would we be for him or away. And at the end of his life, he has no true companion. He exchanged a harem for one bride who would stay by his side. And he says to himself, I am the king who has stopped learning. A poor kid who is wise is better than me. In this place of repentance, of honest reflection, we have chapter 5, and we have the no vanity section. We're not quite to the middle, but near the middle, he gives us a reprieve, because it's about to get very, very dark. But he's looking at these things, and we hit chapter 5, and he goes, all right, let's recalibrate our brains. Again, he knows the conclusion of the book. Now, I have this down as verse 1 through 9 as I'm going through it. Your Bible may have a break between verses 7 and 8, and that's more than fine. In verse 1, Solomon exhorts us, live a righteous life. Draw close to God. Don't live your life like a fool who lives unrighteous lives and goes to the temple and think they could trick God by giving him an offering there. No. God knows. Don't be a fool. After all, verse 2, God is in heaven and you are in earth. There are two great rules of the universe. There is a God and you're not him, and there's the biblical proof. He's in heaven and you're on earth. And from his vantage point, he can see everything that's going on. There is nothing you can do that you can hide from him. Verse 2 through 6, we see an often repeated proverb about controlling your tongue. Don't be hasty in your words. Proverbs 15:2 puts it well, the fool has many words. And Solomon goes, don't be so quick to talk. In endless dreams and many words, there's emptiness. Rather, fear God. And even if you see oppression and injustice in this world, understand there is a higher power, and even the king has to answer to God, verse 9. After this brief reprieve, verse 10, we get to the next area where he tried to see if he could find meaning in it. And he tells us about the futility of riches. Verse 10, Solomon tells us that if you love money for money's sake, you will never be satisfied. No matter how much you gather, it will never be enough. Again, this is not an admonition against hard work. Look at verse 12. He says the hard-working person sleeps well, whether they have a full belly or not. You work hard enough, you will sleep well that night. But the rich person, it doesn't matter how full their belly is. It doesn't matter how much money they have. They can't get a good night's sleep. Why? Because they're worried about keeping it. How do I get more? How do I keep it from going away? Verse 13, Solomon doubles down on this by giving us the first of two grievous evils. It's the only time we have this grievous evils put together in the text. Grievous evil number 1, verse 13, riches that are hoarded by their owners. Because no matter what you do, you can't take it with you when you're gone. We will see this idea later on, but we have this idea that one of the Proverbs tells us there's one who scatters and yet gathers all the more. There's one who gathers to themselves and yet it always seems to be gone. Because this is a grievous evil, someone who gathers for themselves, just for themselves. And he shows us the pointlessness of this in verse 15 when he uses language similar to Job in Job 1:21. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. You came into this world with nothing. You will leave in the same way. And that all makes sense. We're tracking with Solomon, but still Solomon is struggling. So now he goes too far, and he declares a second grievous evil, starting in verse 16. So what's the point of even being born? Solomon, you went too far. Now, in verse 19 through 20, Solomon is going to mention God, but he is operating with an under-the-sun mindset. Yeah, there's a God out there, but we're down here on our own. And verse 18 shows us that Solomon is only considering our few years on this side of the veil. And while Solomon has already taught us that God has put eternity in our heart, that's from chapter 3, Solomon's not considering that truth. Instead, he presents the abundance that God has given us like a pacifier that you give to a baby, a distraction to just keep that baby from crying. And so when you start crying and you whine enough, then he gives you a pacifier. Just leave me alone, kid, and be quiet. And so he gives you enough riches to keep you quiet. But what's it really matter? You can't take it with you when you're gone. It's just a distraction to keep us from thinking how pointless and short our lives really are. Now, we're on a downward slide with Solomon. We go to his deepest point in chapter 6. This is a deep place of melancholy and nihilism for Solomon, where he just reaches this point and goes, what's the point of anything? What is the point if nothing I do matters at all? Verses 1 and 2, Solomon describes this great evil of life. He goes, there is an evil which I have seen, and that's the person who seems to have it all, and then God comes and takes it away. Verse 3 through 6, he declares that a man has, what if a man has a long life, has 100 kids? A baby who's not even born is better off than him. Because at the end of their life, they end up in the very same place, and at least the baby didn't spend his entire life working hard. Yeah, maybe he didn't get to have the joy of all these kids, but what's it matter anyway? Eventually you end up in the same place. And I know how hard those words are. I do not say it to be callous. I know how close to many of our hearts that description is. But do you understand? This is how close it is to Solomon at this point. This is how broken his heart is. He goes beyond it. He goes, you know what? If a person even lived 2,000 years old, twice as long as the longest person who ever lived, and he has to endure this difficult life, even if he had all the kids in the world, it wouldn't matter because eventually he's going to end up in the exact same grave. Verse 7, Solomon ponders the point of all our effort in life. What's the point? You work and you work, but you're never satisfied. Even if you had all the money in the world, is your appetite ever gone? You stuff yourself today, you'll be hungry again tomorrow. What's the point of all your efforts? What advantage is there to be wise? All your learning, all your effort is like striving after the wind. Instead, our days are like a fleeting shadow. Verse 12. Look how dark he is here. What's a shadow do on its own? It does nothing. It is bound to you. It can only do what you do. You still have to put forth all the effort, and all the shadow can possibly do is just wind after you. And when the light goes out, the shadow is gone, and there's nothing there anymore. And he goes, what's the point? Who can say for sure what is good? In chapter 7, Solomon goes, all right, let's shake this off, because I know that can't be right. Because remember, he does know that there is a God in heaven. God is in heaven and we are on earth. Under the sun, everything's vanity. So he's trying to shake off the cobwebs. He starts comparing a wise person to a fool. He goes, no, like, a wise person has to be better than a fool. In verses 1 through 3, he starts off with the struggle. It seems like to a depressed Solomon that it's better to be on one's deathbed than to one being born. This is what he feels like coming out of chapter 6. And he goes, well, that's sort of true. I mean, at least at a funeral, everyone's taking real stock of what's real. At that moment, everything else that seems frivolous and light gets burned away. And you're there in that place. What is real and what is true is what you understand at a funeral, at the birth of a baby. Everything's light, everything's good. Verse 4 through 6, he begins to describe the wise. Verse 4 and 5 is him talking about the wise, but then in verses at the latter part of 5 into verse 6, he describes how fools are like blissful idiots. They don't even know what they don't know. But it doesn't mean they escape harm. He uses very descriptive language. He talks about how their laughter is like the crackling of brush that is burning. The idea is like they're in a pot being boiled. But they can't understand that they're being boiled because they can't hear the fire, because their laughter of fools is like the crackling of the branches burning beneath them. Verse 7 through 9, but that does not mean that the wise person is better off. It doesn't bring you peace to be wise. Verse 7 tells them that oppression has made them mad. So either they look at oppression and they see it and they're so upset it drives them crazy, or they're being oppressed and they're like, it drives me mad because I know it's not supposed to be this way. Verse 10 is very important, especially in our current day. It describes the one who is always living in the past, always talking about the good old days. And God doesn't want to take us back to the good old days. Our God wants to do something new and something good. The Lord Jesus came to pour new wine into new wineskins, not to pour new wine into old. And Solomon tells us that when you hear that, that is not from wisdom that people say these things. They don't understand that to everything there's a season, and when that season is done, you move on to the next. That there's an eternity that we're going forward. We're not looking back at the good old days. Starting in verse 11, we begin to see the pivot in Solomon's life in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you write in your Bible, you may want to make a mark at verse 11 or write pivot and circle these words right there in verse 11. It is good. It's the first time we've seen it so far in the book. Solomon's starting to snap out of it. He's not out of the woods yet. Just like us, we struggle to kick all the mud off of our feet. But we're going to see this idea twice. And these two it is goods are going to be like rungs of a ladder as he's starting to crawl out of the pit. They're going to be like steps of a stair as he's coming out of this dark place. Everything up to this point has practically been vanity and vanity and vanity, and now there's a change. We finally have something that is good. We'll see it in verse 11 and verse 18. In verse 11, he starts with a defensible position. Wisdom and money can be a blessing to the one who is alive. So it's better to be alive than dead for these items, because they act as protection to you if you understand what they are. They can protect you and preserve you if you possess them. And we know that they can be a blessing because we see both wisdom and abundance within the works of God. That he created everything by his wisdom, so there's goodness to that. And we're told throughout the book of Proverbs that if you will take wisdom and bury wisdom in your heart, that wisdom will protect you. And it's better to have resources than not to have resources. God has established these things, and once God has established them, Solomon goes, if the Lord bends something, who's strong enough to make it straight again? The Lord has designed it this way, to be a blessing to those who understand it. Verse 14, Solomon tells us that he has seen everything during his feudal life. He understands there's a person trying to be righteous who dies way too young, and there's a wicked person who seems to have a long life. So because of this, don't be excessively wicked, and don't be excessively good. And we're like, what are you saying, Solomon? Now, when you see this, remember the context that we're talking about, the Mosaic covenant. And when you see excessively righteous or overly righteous, depending on your translation in verse 16, think self-righteous. Think Pharisee, not Jesus. Think zealous prude, not righteous pilgrim. This is someone obsessed with trying to be perfect, verses 18 through 22. trying to be as good as possible, their whole life to observe all these rules so that on the basis of my obedience I can be good. But now we have verse 20. He goes, but there's nobody who's righteous. As Paul will put it, no, not one. Instead, don't take things so seriously. Don't be so thin-skinned. Don't be stumbled with every slight. Don't let everything be something to knock you down and to get you all upset. Because remember verse 20, you've sinned too. You've stumbled somebody too. So relax a little bit. Don't take it so seriously. Verse 23, Solomon knows that he's now on the right track. We don't have it all together, but he goes, we need to keep going on this. Verse 23, so I tested this with wisdom. This is my hypothesis, and I went back and looked at it, and I'm like, okay, parts of it are good. In contrast to Ecclesiastes 2:12, with all my learning, I still could not figure this out. He goes, no, I'm starting to look at this. It seems right. Verse 27, the preacher tells us he combined everything together, all the learning of the world, and this is what he discovered. I am still seeking for an answer, but I have not yet found what I'm looking for. Now, verse 29, I've broken off completely by itself. We don't have a ton of time to go into this, so I'm going to give a short statement that is easy to misinterpret it. Please think it through. And verse 29 is interesting, and it can have many consequences for the idea of original sin, as some people cling to the idea. A common way of looking at original sin is that original sin is like some kind of spiritual cooties that you're born with. You have this disease just clinging to you the moment that you're born. David said that in iniquity I was conceived. Jeremiah tells us that the heart is deceptively wicked. Who can know it? But what we have here is this idea that God gives us, that he created you for uprightness. Now, there's at least two possible interpretations of this. One, that he created mankind upright in the garden, and in the garden, mankind chose to seek out wicked things. That's possible explanation number one. Number two, he created you today for upright living. He wanted you to live a righteous life. And the first chance you got, when you had the moment to make your own decision, you chose wickedness over him. And in the moment that we all, in that first moment, agreed to go after sin, we agreed with Adam. We agreed with his original sin. There are so many ways to consider that. To consider that alongside ideas like the age of accountability. That David's son is in heaven. He never had a chance to offer a sacrifice or declare his heart for the Lord, but God's grace was sufficient for that one who could not make that decision. But the first chance you had to make a decision, you had a choice. Deuteronomy, today I set before you an opportunity to choose. Will you choose life or will you choose death? Please choose life. And for every single last one of us, we all did the same thing. We chose death, which is why we needed a Savior, the only one who chose life. In chapter 8, we start to reach this new section, right? He starts talking about the king. Obey the king, do what the king says. You have to understand chapter 8 in light of chapter 9. Chapter 8 tells us that to obey the command of the king, and we're like, well, that's kind of serving. You're the king, so you're telling us to just do whatever you say. But the beginning of chapter 9 verse 1 tells us this. Even the king has to answer to God. All of his deeds will appear before him. So obey the king, knowing that the king has to answer to God. Verses 10 through 13, though a sinner may lengthen their life by their wicked deeds, it will be well for the one who openly fears God. Because verse 13, what does it matter if they make their life a little cushier here? Their days here are still like a shadow. If they live their lives like only what's under the sun matters, guess what? They're going to find out there is a God in heaven who's above the sun. And they did not live their life at all for him. It will not be good for them then, because they did not fear God here. Verse 14, Solomon explains to us that it is futile to understand the perfect logic behind everything that we see. He goes, you can't. You can try and try all you want, but you won't figure it out. Instead, there is a place to enjoy the life that God gave us. This is not the same as living for pleasure. We saw the problems with that earlier on. Sadly, some Christians think that is the purpose in this life, to make this life as cushy as possible and to enjoy all the blessings God has given to me here so I can live the life that I have earned for myself. He goes, no, but he gave you life to enjoy it. He wants it to be a blessing. Solomon explains that despite all of his wisdom, verse 16, he ended up in the same place Moses told us about in Deuteronomy 29:29. Deuteronomy 29:29, where Moses told us the secret things belong to the Lord, but the things he has revealed are ours forever. The idea is this: God did not explain himself to you. He does not have to explain himself to you. The secret things, the things he chose not to reveal to you in their fullness, those are his business. Those are for him. They belong to him. But what he has given us is everything we need to live this life the way he would have us to live it. It is everything we need, 2 Timothy, to build up our lives and to live it according to him. He has chosen to reveal those things that we need so that we can embrace and learn to follow his word. Chapter 9, verse 1 through 6, we have the opposite of chapter 6. Chapter 6, he says, it's better off to be dead. Here he tells us the opposite. Now, he's still not exactly right. He's still working his way towards chapter 12. But verse 1, he tells us we all have to appear before the Lord. That's what it means when it says their deeds are in the hands of God. That means he sees everything. He's going to judge it. He's going to weigh it. We can't hide anything from him. And this is true, but he's still struggling, and we see his struggle in verse 2. That we will all have the same fate because we're all sinners. And you got a point, Solomon. Therefore, verse 3 through 6, it's better to be alive. For there's no activities planned for the dead. There's nothing for them to do. Surely a live dog is better than a dead lion. Because, verse 6, here we come again, returns to the idea of under the sun. Solomon continues in the same mind frame. So he tells us, you know what, just live a full and happy life. Because there's nothing to look forward to after we're dead, verse 10. Still in the same mental space, he is reminded that under the sun, the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle always won by the strong. Instead, verse 12, we're all like men caught in a fish. Or a fish caught in a net, sorry. Do not judge Solomon for his struggles. Because this idea of being a fish caught in a net, we can all associate with what it is that he is going through. You felt like that at some point. Despite all your struggles, it feels like you're just caught in a net. Sometimes you're at the bottom and everybody's on top of you. Sometimes you get to be at the top and in the sun just a little bit. Some days are hard and you're stuck in the middle and everyone's got their fin in your face and you have no place to go and no place to move. Do not judge Solomon for his struggle, because how many of us have been trapped within our own emotions and our own perceptions. Solomon, the wisest person who ever lived, struggled just like all of us. Verse 13 through 18, he does a case study in wisdom. He goes, all right, this is what it feels like, but let me consider this. Once I saw a small city. An army was coming, it was going to crush it, but that small city was saved by one poor man inside of it who was wise. Yet despite his great service to that city, nobody remembered the man after the battle was done. But Solomon remembered. Solomon learned the lesson. And he understands this, that wisdom is better than weapons of war. But it only takes one sinner. Think Achan, Joshua chapter 7. Achan, just one sinner can ruin the war for everybody. Chapter 10. At the end of chapter 9, Solomon rediscovered, if you will, the importance of wisdom. Okay, I saw this. This worked. Wisdom is better. Even if no one remembers you, it's better to have wisdom. The effects that you can have are awesome. So in chapter 10 and 11, he gives us a series of proverbs. Many of these are echoes of the principles we studied in the book of Proverbs, so I won't go through each one like we did with the book of Proverbs. I'm just going to point a couple of them out. Verse 1. A little foolishness has more impact than wisdom or honor. The idea is this: if I'm up here on the stage and you come up here and you're smaller than I am, is it easier for me to pick your dead weight up off the ground and to bring it onto the stage, or for you to just turn into dead weight and to drag me down? Obviously the second. To drag down is so much easier. Because it only takes a little foolishness to ruin it all. That's the lesson at the end of the previous chapter. Verse 3, everything the fool does is foolish. Even when he walks down the road, he can't seem to do that right. Even the smallest things for the fool is foolishness because they're a fool. Verse 10, like a sharp axe, wisdom gives you the best chance at success. So take your time and think your way through. If you have a dull axe and you're just swinging it at that tree, for every time it sticks, how many times is it bouncing off? And you're wasting all this effort instead of just taking the time, sharpening the axe, and cutting it down proper. He said, God gave you a brain for a reason. Use it. Keep your axe sharp. Verse 14, the fool talks and talks. Verse 15, foolishness is exhausting. 16 through 17, it is a bad thing if your leaders spend the morning stuffing their faces and spend the rest of the day on the couch. For everything, there's a season. When your mind and your brain are the sharpest, time to work and to be productive. But if you go and you begin your day dulling your senses, then what use are you going to be the rest of the day? Chapter 11. In chapter 11, we have more Proverbs, but now he's starting to narrow it down, talking about resources. Resources are the result of your toil, the result of your life. So he's bringing it all together as we work toward chapter 12. He's rolling back his previous statements about the futility of toil and work. Remember before, the idea was, what's the point? What's the point of working so hard? But now Solomon has realized the truth of his closing statement in chapter 8. God's ways are above our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Therefore, be wise and industrious with what God has given to us. For, verse 5, we don't know what God is doing behind the scenes. He gave you an opportunity for a reason. He gave you the ability to work for a reason. So follow through with the pursuits that he's placed in front of you. Be obedient to what it is that he is calling you to do. You don't know what God is up to, the things you can't even see. Now, verse 1 is very, very interesting, and I need to mention it because there's some weird ideas that have come out of it. This idea is beautiful and poetic. The idea of casting your bread upon the waters. It does not mean throw your resources away. Rather, verse 1 has to be combined with verse 2. Verse 2 says, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Split up your resources among different opportunities so if one goes bad, it won't take everything down with it. That's smart. You're using these resources well. Be prudent with what it is that God has given to you. And part of being prudent with what God has given you may be the idea of casting your bread upon the waters, with the idea of waters being what we will see in the New Testament, being a representation of people. The idea that I heard a sound of many waters, people before the throne like many waters, and it's this sound of all their roaring voices come together, like a great waterfall all combining together. And it may be the idea of be generous to all those people that God places in front of you. Cast your bread, scatter so that you will gather all the more. But don't cast it out there with the purpose that I want to gather for myself, because there is folly in seeking after riches. Invest in others, and your investment will come back to you. But please pay attention to me right now. This is not the same incredibly manipulative idea of giving someone your seed, faith, money, so you can get lots of money in return. It is not that. There is no part of that horrible teaching that is at all consistent with the Word of God. Even in Malachi, when he goes, test me in this, do this and see if I don't bless you. The idea is not, give me a little so I'll give you a lot. Because I promise you, if you test him on that, you will see how wonderful he is. And the second time you test it, he'll probably be good to you too. But eventually you'll come to a line where you go, I have the system all figured out. I give this much, he gives me that much, and then you give him this much, and he gives you nothing. Because he's testing your heart to see whether you really trust him, or do you trust all those zeros in your bank account? God is generous. Do not give with the plan of receiving. He gave us so much that we did not have to pay for. Give with no expectation of getting anything in return. To do anything else is to fall into the folly of seeking riches. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Verses 9 through 10 is important. Solomon is addressing a young man. Here, finally, we get down to who this is for. It's for his kid. Remember, his son is not just a son. His son's going to be the next king of Israel. The one who's going to sit on the throne of David. Somehow, through our line, is going to come the Messiah. This is important stuff to Solomon's head. Now what he is doing what a preacher is called to do, to teach the next generation and to try to keep them from making the same mistakes as the generation who went before them. So he tells this up-and-comer, enjoy the life that God has given to you. Life is short, and you go this way but once. It is one of the best things that the Lord showed us when the boys were still little. And it is one of the most common bits of advice that I will give to any parent when they're brand new. Enjoy every moment, every dirty diaper, every sleepless night. Enjoy all the problems, every spanking you have to give, every scolding that you have to issue. Enjoy all of those moments because you go this way but once. And there will come a day when you see how old they get and you will go, I would give everything in the world to go back when they were little. And they were just so much fun. You go this way but once. Enjoy every moment that God gives you. But over every moment, remember this. God is the divine judge. And one day you will appear before his throne. So make good decisions while you live this life. Chapter 12. Solomon is still trying to keep this young person from chapter 11 from making the mistakes that Solomon made. We have gone through the journey. We're like, this was rough, Solomon. You went into some dark, dark places. And he's like, please, learn from me. Don't make the same mistakes that I made. And he gives him the advice like this. He goes, learn to love the Lord, verse 1, learn to love the Lord while you are still young, because it is so much hard to learn to love him when you're old and bitter and your days become hard. It's a lesson that Kendra and I learned when we were starting again to walk with the Lord coming out of the crucible season, and we were told this, that the number one impediment to young people following the call that God has on their life are Christian parents. Because their advice is always the same. Well, you have time to follow the Lord later. Go to college first. Get your career. Get everything going. Get your retirement first. And then when you're older and you have everything all set, then's the time that you give your life to the Lord. Now, Malachi is going to talk about this. Well, the Lord will talk through Malachi about this. And he goes, how about you give that kind of offering to your governors? Give them the leftovers of your life. Don't give them the best part of your life. Oh, no. Give them the leftovers, the lame, the one that you don't want for yourself. When after you've had all your fun, then you give them this little bit and go, here you go. This is for you. And we'll see if your governor will accept that offering. He goes, instead, do this. Learn to love him while you're young. While you have all your life to listen to the voice of the Lord. Don't try to do it later on. You're going to be too old, too stuck in your ways. Instead, remember verse 5, young man, that everyone ends up the same way at the end of this life. So remember the Lord before the end. Verse 6 is a really interesting image. This is one of those moments where the poetry of Solomon just jumps off the page. He has this idea about a silver cord and a golden bowl. The idea is of a cistern, and you use these to go down and get the water to come back up. This is likely the instruments that were used for Solomon's private cistern. This is what he drank from. When he wanted to drink of water, the servants went to this, and with a golden bowl and a silver cord, they went down into the water to get Solomon's personal water supply. And he goes, then eventually it's going to break. Eventually it's all going to be crushed. And remember who he's talking to. He's talking to his kid. The same one who's looking at this silver cord and this golden bowl and go, one day I'm going to be fed from that. I'm going to drink my water from that. And just like he does throughout all the Proverbs when he's talking to his child, he tells him this here, I don't care who you think you are, because that golden bowl and that silver cord are eventually going to break. It does not matter who you think you are, because in the end, we will all appear before the Lord. There is a God of the universe, and you are not him. In verse 8, Solomon gives us his final proclamation of life under the sun. If there is no eternity, if there is no God, then there is no point to any part of life. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Except, verse 9, there is a king, and he is not under the sun. And the preacher who exhausted himself with learning has found the conclusion of all life in verse 13. Fear God and keep his commandments. And this applies to everyone, because the Lord who is in heaven sees all things, and in the end he will judge both the quick and the dead. Father, we love you. I praise you for who you are.